Phoenix waited more than 20 years for this headline. The Canal Murders solved. A man arrested. A conviction secured. Two young women, gone since the early 1990s, finally had their names spoken in court with justice behind them. The story opened again in January 2015, inside an ordinary Chili's restaurant near the old Metrocenter Mall. Detectives from Phoenix PD sat at a booth pretending to eat lunch. Across the room, their suspect chatted with a friend, a tall man in his early 40s with a soft voice and a neatly trimmed beard. His name was Bryan Patrick Miller. Around the local cosplay circuit, he was known as the Zombie Hunter, a man who drove a black Ford Crown Victoria with police-style lights and a vanity plate that literally read Zombie Hunter. He laughed easily that day, ordered a burger, and drank water. When the check came, he left the glass on the table. The detectives waited until he walked out, then quietly slid it into an evidence bag. That glass carried what 22 years of investigation could not, a trace of his DNA. Within days, lab results confirmed a match to biological evidence collected from two murder scenes along the Arizona Canal, one from 1992, one from 1993. The profile was identical. For Phoenix detectives, the message from the crime lab was almost unbelievable. The Canal Murderer, a ghost story whispered through 3 decades of squad rooms, now had a name. They built the arrest team overnight. At sunrise on the 13th of January 2015, officers surrounded Miller's townhouse near the intersection of 7th Avenue and Mountain View. Neighbors watched from porches as unmarked cars rolled in. Miller stepped outside carrying his bicycle helmet. He looked confused but calm as detectives read him his rights. By noon, every newsroom in the valley had the headline, "Zombie Hunter Arrested in 1990s Canal Murders." Police spokespeople were careful that day. They said only that advances in DNA technology had led to the break. What they didn't reveal publicly was the quiet partnership behind it, a forensic genealogy team that had helped narrow the field through familial matching, identifying relatives of the unknown killer before police obtained the direct sample. For families who had waited more than 2 decades, that single announcement reopened old wounds and offered something like relief. Angela Brasso's mother told reporters she had prayed every day for a name. Melanie Bernis's sister said she'd stopped believing the call would ever come. In 2023, after years of pre-trial motions and psychiatric evaluations, Judge Suzanne Cohen delivered the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Miller received 2 death sentences, one for each victim. No jury, he had chosen a bench trial, but the outcome was decisive. Reporters inside the courtroom described him as expressionless while the ruling was read. Outside, a crowd gathered on the courthouse steps, holding framed photos of the victims, the same senior portraits and cycling shots that had circulated in missing person flyers back in the 1990 seconds. For investigators, it was the end of a career-long chase. Detective Jennifer Erickson, who inherited the cold file in 2012, said afterward, "It never felt finished until that glass of water." The Phoenix Canal Murders had long symbolized the city's uneasy growth suburban sprawl built around narrow desert waterways that seemed peaceful until they weren't. Between 1992 and 1993, 2 young women were killed while biking along those paths. The crimes appeared linked, but evidence ran dry as fast as the canals themselves. It took the evolution of DNA databases and the patience of a new generation of detectives to close the gap. Every story like this has a hinge, the moment when the past stops being mystery and starts being memory. For Phoenix, that hinge was the day the lab report came back with one name typed across the top: Miller, Bryan Patrick. The case had always been about 2 victims, but the resolution turned attention toward a 3rd missing girl, Brandy Myers, 13 years old, when she disappeared in 1992 from a neighborhood not far from Miller's home. Police still haven't found her body. That unsolved thread keeps the Canal Murders from feeling truly finished. For the city, though, the verdict closed the central chapter. The killer, once nicknamed the Zombie Hunter, would spend the rest of his life under sentence of death. The canal paths, once symbols of fear, now carry small memorial plaques in memory of Angela and Melanie's simple metal markers catching the desert light. If you like cases where one overlooked clue flips a whole city, you're in the right place. Because this one turned on something almost invisible, a fingerprint's modern cousin, hidden in a sip of water. But to understand how that moment came to be, we have to go back to where it began. 2 young women, 2 bicycles, and one quiet November night along the water's edge. Phoenix, in the early 1990 seconds, was stretching outward faster than the streets could be paved. New condos pressed against vacant desert. Streetlights stopped, but bike paths continued for miles along the irrigation canals that powered the city's growth. By day, they looked harmless blue water under the sun, cyclists waving as they passed. By night, they were long corridors of silence. The 8th of November 1992, 22-year-old Angela Brasso left her apartment near 25th Avenue and Cactus for her usual evening ride. She was a recent ASU graduate working at a computer company, proud of her independence, careful about routines. Neighbors saw her in a pink cycling outfit, helmet, and a bright headlamp. She told her boyfriend she'd be gone about an hour. When she didn't come home, he started calling friends, then police. At first, officers assumed a late ride or a mechanical issue. Then, at sunrise, a man walking his dog noticed something floating near a grate in the canal. Patrol units sealed the area. Reporters would later say even veteran detectives paused before they stepped closer. The scene was violent, deliberate, and unlike anything Phoenix had seen in years. Angela's bike was recovered nearby, propped awkwardly in the brush as though someone had tried to hide it. Investigators collected tire impressions, footprints, and biological samples, preserving them in the earliest generation of DNA evidence kits. But there was no suspect, no witness, and no clear motive. The case landed on Detective Mike McGee's desk. He called it a predator's work. For weeks, teams combed every inch of the canal banks. Nothing more turned up. Then, as winter came and the story faded from nightly news, Phoenix tried to move on. Almost a year passed. The 21st of September 1993. 17-year-old Melanie Burness, a high school senior and member of her school's ROTC, left home on her bicycle for a ride along the same canal system. She never returned. Search teams spent days tracing the route until, 11 days later, a patrol helicopter spotted something in the water near 16th Street and Glendale Avenue. It was Melanie. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Both victims were young, both cyclists, both attacked near canal access points, and both left in the water. The evidence told investigators the same man had committed both murders. Inside the crime lab, technicians compared DNA from each scene. The profile matched one unknown male. But in 1993, Arizona didn't yet have CODIS, the national DNA database. The result became a number on a printout and went into a refrigerated archive. Detectives held news conferences, pleading for help. Tips poured in. They interviewed joggers, workers from nearby industrial yards, and several men seen fishing at night. Every lead fizzled. For a time, Phoenix police believed the killer might have left town. But the case stayed active. Each new homicide was quietly checked against the canal pattern. None fit. Years passed. Detectives retired. The city changed. Metrocenter Mall, once a landmark near the canal route, began to empty. By the 2000s, the Brasso and Burness files filled several boxes in cold case storage, labeled simply Canal. Inside were photographs, lab reports, and a frozen DNA vial still waiting for a match. In 2011, technology finally caught up. Arizona's Department of Public Safety upgraded its DNA system and uploaded the canal profile to CODIS. No hit. But around the same time, private genealogists were beginning to map family trees through public databases, the same science that would later solve the Golden State Killer case. Phoenix detectives started considering that possibility. By 2014, a specialized unit reviewed the canal files again. Detective Jennifer Erickson, new to the team, spent months rereading witness statements. She requested retesting of fibers and the DNA sample using updated methods. That test produced the same male profile, crisp and complete. When compared against genealogy databases, it revealed a cluster of relatives tracing back to a family line with Arizona roots. The name Miller appeared more than once. Investigators dug into the history. A man named Bryan Miller, who had lived near both crime scenes in the 1990 seconds. Old police records showed he'd once been questioned not as a suspect, but as a witness in a separate assault near Paradise Valley Mall. He'd also been linked to a 1992 disappearance of a young girl named Brandy Myers, though never charged. Now his DNA seemed to orbit the canal case. Surveillance units followed him. They collected trash, coffee cups, anything discarded. Each time, contamination or incomplete samples stalled the test. Finally, the team planned the restaurant ruse at Chili's, the one that would give them the clear match. But that's the turning point still to come. Back in the 1990 seconds, none of this existed yet. Back then, the Canal Murders were an open wound. Two families waiting for answers, a city afraid of its own waterways, and detectives haunted by a file they couldn't close. Angela and Melanie were more than victims. They represented an era when Phoenix was still learning how fast a city could grow and how easily fear could travel those canals at night. Their stories deserve to be told in full, not just how they died, but how they lived. That's where we go next. Before they were names in a headline, they were two young women chasing the same promise: independence in a growing city. Angela Brasso had moved to Phoenix from the Midwest. She was 22, a recent Arizona State University graduate with a degree in mechanical engineering. She worked for a computer graphics company near Deer Valley, one of the few women in her department. Friends called her disciplined, calm, a little shy until you mentioned bicycles. She saved for a mountain bike the way others saved for a car. The canal trails behind her apartment were her favorite route, a quiet ribbon of water between neighborhoods. Her boyfriend, John, said she loved the smell of creosote after rain and that she rode almost every evening just before sunset. Angela had just celebrated her birthday. She was planning a weekend trip north to Prescott. Her mother later told reporters, she was so proud to be standing on her own 2 feet. She had everything ahead of her. A year later, on the opposite side of town, 17-year-old Melanie Burness was finishing high school. She was part of junior ROTC, played flute in the marching band, and wanted to join the Air Force after graduation. Friends remembered her as steady, the kind of person who kept everyone organized. She lived with her parents in a quiet North Phoenix neighborhood, the sort of tract development that was new in the early 90s, cul-de-sacs, gravel lawns, and a canal access gate just 2 blocks away. That gate became her shortcut to school and the recreation center. Melanie's brother, years later, told a reporter, "We thought of those trails as safe. They were just there. You could see houses on both sides." She often rode at dusk, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. Her bicycle, a purple 10-speed, was her sense of freedom. Phoenix in that era was both optimistic and uneasy. Population was booming, but so were headlines about heat, crime, and the sprawl outrunning services. The canals, part of the Salt River Project's network, cut through every neighborhood like unguarded corridors. They were engineered for water, not people, but they became accidental parks, walking paths, bike routes, shortcuts home. Most residents barely noticed the narrow dirt shoulders beside them. After Angela's death, that changed. Joggers started carrying pepper spray. Parents drove their kids to school instead of letting them ride. By the time Melanie vanished, the canal system had turned from a symbol of growth into a symbol of danger. Angela and Melanie never met, but their routines mirrored each other. Both were responsible, physically active, and known for calling home if they'd be late. Both left on short evening rides from apartments or houses less than a mile from canal access points. Both disappeared within minutes of leaving familiar ground. Detectives studying their cases later noted how predictable those habits were. Whoever attacked them likely learned that rhythm, the same hour, the same route, the same isolation, once the streetlights thinned out. For Angela's parents, the days after her disappearance blurred into interviews, searches, and phone calls. Her mother kept answering the phone, hoping Angela would pick up on the other end. When police confirmed her identity, the family returned to Phoenix to pack up her apartment. They left the bike helmet hanging on the wall where she'd kept it. Melanie's family faced a similar vacuum nearly a year later. Her father refused to sell her bicycle. He stored it in the garage for decades, tires deflated, waiting for a reason to let it go. Every year, both families placed flowers at the canal. Neighbors joined them. They would stand silently for a few minutes, then leave. Those gestures became small acts of defiance, reminders that the women were more than victims, that they had been students, daughters, friends. When the murders went unsolved, fear settled in like summer dust. Young women in Phoenix traded warnings. Don't ride alone, stay off the canal, carry a flashlight. Some police officers who worked the case later admitted it haunted them more than others because of the randomness. No robbery, no known connection, no clear motive. Angela and Melanie's lives became symbols in the media, but for their families, they stayed personal. Angela's co-workers remembered her tinkering with CAD drawings. Melanie's classmates remembered her laughter during band practice. Their photographs appeared every time the case resurfaced in the news. The same two smiles, the same desert backdrop, reminding viewers that the victims were real people with futures abruptly stopped. Even after the 2015 arrest, family members described mixed emotions. Angela's mother said, "It's hard to feel relief when you remember the person she was." Melanie's sister spoke at the sentencing hearing in 2023. "For 30 years we imagined who he might be, now we know. But knowing doesn't erase the empty chair." Decades apart, the two families often attended the same memorial events. They found each other through shared loss, the kind only another victim's parent understands. If the Canal Murders became one of Phoenix's most famous cold cases, it was because of them, because they refused to let their daughters' names fade. The headlines will always focus on the killer and the science that caught him. But every case like this begins with the people who were lost, and the ordinary lives that once filled the silence. Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness were those lives, young, determined, trusting their city. What happened next shattered that trust. In Phoenix, the evenings come quickly. Daylight drops fast, shadows slide down the canal banks, and the desert air cools enough for a quiet ride before dinner. That's all it was meant to be, a ride. A familiar loop through neighborhoods that felt safe. November 8, 1992. 22-year-old Angela Brasso finished dinner early with her boyfriend, checked the clock, and decided to take her usual route along the Arizona Canal. She was careful, predictable, and proud of that new mountain bike she'd saved up for. Neighbors later remembered seeing her leave around 8 o'clock, a red cycling jersey bright against the dimming light. She told her boyfriend she'd be back in an hour. When an hour passed, he called her apartment. No answer. Another hour. Still nothing. By 10 o'clock, he called police. Officers logged the case as a missing person, but they didn't wait until morning. A small patrol unit drove the canal access road, shining spotlights along the path. They found fresh bicycle tracks, then lost them in the dust. There was no sign of Angela, no sound, no struggle. The desert night swallowed everything. By sunrise, that search turned grim. A man walking his dog along the canal near 25th Avenue noticed something in the water. He called 911. Within minutes, patrol cars and detectives flooded the area. Yellow tape stretched across the access road, and Phoenix police began what would become one of the city's longest-running homicide investigations. The crime scene was extensive. Officers worked in silence, documenting everything: footprints, tire marks, the position of Angela's bike, found a short distance from the water. Detectives would spend days combing through the area, searching for clues. By nightfall, the city knew. A young woman had been murdered along the canal trail. For the next several weeks, Phoenix lived under a kind of collective unease. The canal, once a symbol of calm, now looked like a border between safety and something darker. People avoided it after sunset. Parents stopped letting their kids ride to school. The story stayed on front pages for days, the victim's smile beside photos of police along the water. Then, time passed. The investigation slowed, and the city, still uneasy, tried to move forward. Almost a year later, it happened again. September 21st, 1993. 17-year-old Melanie Burness left home for an evening bike ride. She was a high school senior, a member of her school's ROTC program, and she used the canal trail as her training route. She told her parents she'd be back soon. When she missed curfew, they drove the path themselves, headlights sweeping the dirt embankments, calling her name. When officers arrived, the pattern felt too familiar. Another young woman. Another bicycle. Another quiet stretch of canal. 11 days later, a patrol helicopter spotted something in the water near 16th Street and Glendale Avenue. Search teams converged, and the news spread before detectives could confirm the details. For investigators, the similarities were undeniable. Same type of victim. Same canal corridor. Same method. The canal murderer, they feared, had returned. Detectives pulled the files from the year before. They compared evidence, scene photos, and lab results. The DNA profile from both murders matched a single unknown male. One man had taken 2 lives, a year apart, in almost the same place. But in 1993, DNA databases didn't exist. The information sat on a report, handwritten in black ink, and there was nowhere to send it. The case would have to wait for the future. As news of the second murder broke, fear returned to Phoenix. Reporters camped outside police headquarters. City leaders urged calm but couldn't promise safety. The police chief announced a task force dedicated to the Canal Murders. Canal. Dozens of detectives, lab techs, and patrol units joined in. They mapped every trail intersection and logged every call about suspicious activity. For months, officers walked those canals at dusk, flashlights scanning the brush. Volunteers searched vacant lots. The Arizona Republic printed hotline numbers across its front page. Tips poured in, hundreds of them, but none pointed to a name. Still, detectives kept searching. They collected fiber samples, tire prints, shoe impressions. They interviewed anyone who lived along the canal: maintenance workers, delivery drivers, even regular joggers. Each interview added pages to the file, but not one step closer to a suspect. As weeks turned into months, the case settled into a grim rhythm. Officers would chase a lead, rule it out, and return to square one. Families of both victims attended every press conference, standing quietly behind police spokespeople. Their faces appeared on the evening news almost as often as the detectives. They waited for something, anything that might connect the dots. By the end of 1993, no new evidence had surfaced. The city's fear turned to fatigue. People began using the canals again, but always in pairs. The yellow tape was gone, yet the shadow remained. For Angela and Melanie's families, life split in two before and after. Holidays were quieter. Phone calls from police brought hope that always ended with the same phrase: no new leads. The boxes of evidence grew thicker, the headlines thinner, and the case that had once gripped Phoenix began to fade from the nightly news. But not from the minds of those who worked it. Every detective who touched the file said the same thing: it felt unfinished. Too deliberate, too precise, too cruel to stay hidden forever. Years later, when cold case detectives would reopen the file, they would study these same nights: the roots, the timing, the choices. Two ordinary evenings that became a city's enduring mystery. What no one knew then was that the answers already existed, sealed in a vial of DNA collected on those nights, waiting quietly for the future to find it. Morning light rolled across North Phoenix. Officers had been out all night searching for a missing cyclist named Angela Brasso. At sunrise, a dog walker near the canal called 911. What he'd found ended the search and started a homicide investigation. Detectives from Phoenix PD's homicide unit rushed to the scene. They closed off a half-mile stretch of canal and began marking evidence. Numbered yellow flags dotted the embankment. Tire prints, shoe impressions, small traces of disturbed ground. Angela's mountain bike was found in the brush, not far from the water. Reporters gathered fast. By midday, helicopters hovered overhead. Phoenix had its headline: "Cyclist Found Dead Near Canal." That evening, police held a press conference. They warned residents to stay off canal trails after dark. They opened a public tip line. It rang almost constantly for days. Every call brought hope, and almost every call went nowhere. A man swore he'd seen a suspicious pickup parked near the canal. A woman reported someone following joggers. None of it fit. The case felt like it had opened a door to darkness and found nothing inside. Within 48 hours, fear settled over the city. The canal system was part of daily life, a network of quiet paths running through neighborhoods. Now it looked different: empty, unsafe, unpredictable. At a community meeting, officers faced hundreds of worried residents. Parents wanted to know if they should let their daughters ride bikes again. Police promised more patrols, more lighting, more eyes on the water. What they didn't say publicly was this: detectives believed the killer probably lived close by. He knew the canals. He knew how to move along them unseen. They began door-to-door interviews across a 1-mile radius of the crime scene. Maintenance workers, apartment tenants, delivery drivers, anyone who might have been out that night. The list grew to more than 200 names. Investigators collected blood samples from men who matched rough descriptions given by residents. Each sample went to the state lab in Tucson. Each test came back negative. Through winter and into spring, detectives chased leads across the valley. They compared tire tracks from the scene to dozens of mountain bike models. They interviewed anyone with a violent record in the area. Nothing matched. Sergeant Mike McGee called it evidence-rich but lead-poor. The DNA profile existed a string of numbers and letters, but in 1992, there was no database to match it. That genetic fingerprint sat frozen in a lab freezer, waiting for a future that didn't yet exist. Angela's family refused to let the case fade. They checked in with detectives every week. At Christmas, they dropped off cookies at the homicide unit, as thanks. Those visits kept Angela's name on the whiteboard long after other cases rotated off. By the next summer, the search had slowed. No suspect, no motive, no closure. Then, it happened again. September 1993. 17-year-old Melanie Bernis disappeared along the same canal system. Detectives recognized the pattern instantly. Same location, same time of day, same kind of victim. When her body was found 11 days later, police were certain the same man had struck twice. The two cases merged into one task force. Detectives compared lab results, trace fibers, and witness statements. The DNA from both scenes matched exactly one profile, one killer. For investigators, the confirmation was devastating. It meant Angela's death hadn't been a one-time horror. It was the start of something larger. Phoenix PD called in help from state investigators and FBI profilers from Quantico. The profile they produced described a local male, likely in his 20s, familiar with bikes, comfortable near water, and bold enough to strike close to home. Composite sketches circulated through the valley, but no one recognized him. Public pressure intensified. By the end of 1993, local papers had given the killer a name, the Canal Murderer. Editorials questioned whether Phoenix police were overwhelmed by the city's rapid growth. The mayor authorized overtime funding and increased the reward to $50,000. Despite it all, the investigation hit a wall. There was simply no technology to identify the DNA profile. The killer had vanished back into the sprawl. Each summer, reporters revisited the case. Each summer, detectives reopened the boxes of evidence, hoping new science could help. They compared fibers, soil samples, even paint chips. Every test ended the same way, inconclusive. By 1995, the Canal Murders file was moved to cold case storage. The cardboard boxes were labeled, "Do not destroy." Inside were photos, lab reports, and one small vial of DNA sealed in glass. Detectives kept a photocopy of Angela and Melanie's portraits on the bulletin board. Next to it, a note in red marker: "No statute of limitations on murder." For Phoenix, time dulled the fear, but not the memory. People returned to the canal trails, but rarely alone. Families of the victims wrote letters to each new police chief, asking if there was anything new to test. The answer was always the same: not yet. It would take more than 2 decades, new technology, new detectives, and one overlooked clue to bring the case back to life. The trail that began beside the canal in 1992 would end at a restaurant table in 2015. Time kept moving. The canals grew quiet. But for 2 families, the silence was unbearable. By the mid-90s, detectives who had filled the caseboards with maps and photographs were leaving the department or retiring. The Canal Murders, the killings of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernas, were reduced to cardboard boxes stacked on a shelf in cold case storage, each marked with a strip of red tape and the words, "Do not destroy." Every so often, a new officer would open one. They'd study the photographs, skim the reports, trace the same routes on an old street map, and then close the box again. Nothing new to test. Nothing new to try. The DNA profile from the 1,990 seconds was still viable, but there was no database large enough to identify it. That single, perfect genetic code sat frozen in the state crime lab, waiting for science to catch up. Detective Mike McGee, who had led the first investigation, retired in 2002. He took with him a copy of the case summary and a habit of checking the news each morning, hoping for the words, "Cold case solved." He later said, "It was the one case I couldn't file away in my mind." Each year, reporters would call to ask if there was progress. There never was. The DNA was good, but the technology wasn't there yet. When Arizona finally joined the FBI's National DNA Network, CODIS, in the early 2000s, the canal profile was uploaded immediately. Detectives waited for a hit. None came. The killer had left no record, no prior arrest, no trace in any system. For Angela's mother and Melanie's sister, that silence was its own kind of torment. Angela's family wrote yearly letters to the Phoenix Police Department, asking if anything had changed. Melanie's sister called each time she saw a news story about a cold case solved by DNA. She kept a scrapbook of those headlines, waiting for the day one of them would carry her sister's name. Years turned into decades. The canals remained part of Phoenix life: joggers, cyclists, families out for evening walks, but the murders hung over them like a shadow that refused to fade. Then, slowly, the science changed. By 2010, DNA analysis could pull a profile from a trace no bigger than a fingerprint. A new generation of detectives began revisiting the old files. Among them was Jennifer Erickson, a data-driven investigator assigned to the cold case unit in 2012. When she opened the Canal Murders file, she found the familiar story: 2 victims, 1 killer, no match. But the DNA reports caught her attention. They weren't partial samples, they were complete profiles, preserved perfectly for 20 years. She ordered a retest using the latest technology. The result was the same, only sharper. A perfect genetic fingerprint, still waiting for a name. Erickson began asking new questions. If they couldn't find the suspect directly, could they find his relatives? Genealogy, still new to law enforcement, was beginning to change the field. The idea was simple: use public databases of DNA submitted by everyday people, trace family connections, and build backward toward an unknown suspect. It had worked in a few cases out of California. Erickson wanted to try it here. Phoenix approved funding for a forensic genealogy lab. The results came back months later: a spreadsheet of distant relatives, cousins, second cousins, family lines spreading out like a map. One surname appeared again and again: Miller. That single clue brought the case back to life. The name sounded familiar to one veteran detective still on the force. He remembered a young man named Bryan Patrick Miller, who had lived near both canal crime scenes in the early 1990 seconds. Back then, Miller had been questioned in a separate assault near Paradise Valley Mall but was never charged. He'd also been mentioned, though never arrested, in the 1992 disappearance of a 13-year-old girl named Brandy Myers. Her body had never been found. When the cold case team pulled his record, the details were chilling. He had been in his 20s at the time of the murders. He rode a bicycle. He worked odd jobs around the same neighborhoods as both victims. And now, decades later, his extended family's DNA lined up with the killers. Detectives began surveillance quietly. By 2014, Miller was in his early 40s, divorced, and raising a teenage daughter. He worked as a repair technician at a local warehouse. To neighbors, he seemed quiet, polite, even reserved. But around Phoenix's cosplay conventions, he was better known by another name: the Zombie Hunter. He drove a decommissioned police car with lights on the roof and a custom plate that read Zombie Hunter. He dressed in costume, carried a fake shotgun, and posed for photos at fan events. To the outside world, it looked eccentric, even harmless. To investigators, it looked like a man hiding in plain sight. The team needed his DNA to confirm the link, but they couldn't ask for a warrant without probable cause. So they waited. They followed him, collecting anything he threw away: coffee cups, napkins, plastic forks. Each attempt failed. The samples were contaminated or incomplete. Then, in January 2015, they caught a break. Miller met a friend for dinner at a Chili's near the old Metrocenter Mall. Detectives watched from a nearby booth. He ordered water. When he left, they collected the glass. Back at the lab, technicians swabbed the rim and ran the test. Within days, the call came in. The sample was a perfect match to the Canal Murders. The DNA from 1992 and 1993 matched the man drinking water in that Chili's. After 23 years, Phoenix police finally had their suspect. On the 13th of January 2015, just after sunrise, they moved in. Miller walked out of his townhouse wearing a bicycle helmet. Detectives surrounded him and read his rights. He said little. Neighbors watched from their porches as officers led him away. By noon, the news hit every local station. Zombie Hunter arrested in 1992's Canal Murders. Angela Brasso's and Melanie Burness's families got the call they'd waited half a lifetime to hear. The words were simple: "We think we have him." But behind them were 20 years of grief, doubt, and faith that the truth would surface. For Phoenix, the cold case that had haunted a generation was finally warm again. All because of time, technology, and one detective who refused to let a story end without a name. For nearly 20 years, the Canal Murders sat silent. 2 young women, 2 families, and 1 unknown man, a genetic ghost trapped in an evidence freezer. Then, in 2012, a new detective picked up the file. Her name was Jennifer Erickson. She joined the Phoenix Police Department's cold case unit with a reputation for patience and persistence, exactly the qualities this investigation needed. Erickson had grown up in Phoenix. She remembered the original headlines, remembered how the city had changed its habits after the murders. Now, decades later, she was holding the case that had shaped her hometown's sense of fear. She began where most investigators wouldn't, by reading every page. More than 4,000 reports, handwritten notes, photos faded by time, and one consistent thread, an unidentified male DNA profile linking both murders. That single clue had been rock solid since the 1,990 seconds. The problem wasn't the evidence. It was the lack of a database to compare it to. So Erickson decided to test the limits of new technology. She sent the preserved samples to the Arizona Department of Public Safety's Modern Crime Lab. When the results came back, the profile was still there, as clear as the day it was collected. Every genetic marker, intact. Science had caught up. Now it was time to use it. In 2014, forensic genealogy was just beginning to enter police work. The method had solved a handful of cases across the country, but it was still experimental, even controversial. The idea was simple but powerful. Use publicly available genealogy databases, find people who share DNA with the unknown suspect, then build a family tree outward until you find the one person who fits every detail. It was a marriage of science and detective work. And it was about to crack a case that had haunted Phoenix for more than 2 decades. Erickson and her team sent the Canal Murders DNA to an outside genealogy lab. Weeks passed. Then, an email arrived, a long spreadsheet of matches. Most were distant cousins, but the pattern was unmistakable. A cluster of relatives traced back to a single extended family line in Arizona. And one surname appeared again and again: Miller. The team began cross-referencing addresses, ages, and old police records. One name jumped out: Bryan Patrick Miller. He had lived near both crime scenes in the early 1990 seconds. He rode a bicycle. He matched the age range the FBI had profiled back in 1993. And he had once been questioned, though never charged, in another local assault case. Erickson's instinct told her this wasn't coincidence. But science needed confirmation. To prove the match, investigators had to collect Miller's DNA directly and secretly. They began surveillance. He was easy to track. He still lived in North Phoenix, worked at an Amazon warehouse, and raised a teenage daughter. He was quiet, polite, the kind of neighbor who waved but kept to himself. Outside that neighborhood, though, he had a strange persona. In the local cosplay and Comic-Con scene, he was known as the Zombie Hunter. He drove a retired police car fitted with flashing lights and a custom plate that read, "Zombie Hunter." He posed for photos at conventions, dressed in tactical gear, carrying a replica shotgun. To most, it was performance. To detectives, it was chilling. They followed him for weeks, trying to collect a DNA sample from something he discarded: coffee cups, utensils, napkins. Each time, contamination ruined the evidence. It wasn't enough. Then, in January 2015, came their chance. Miller met a friend for dinner at a Chili's near Metrocenter Mall. The cold case team set up inside, pretending to eat. They watched him laugh, drink water, and leave the glass on the table. Once he walked out, detectives quietly bagged the glass and sent it to the state lab. Days later, the call came in. It was a match. A perfect one. After 23 years, Phoenix police had their suspect and the proof to back it up. At dawn on the 13th of January 2015, they surrounded Miller's townhouse near 7th Avenue. He stepped outside wearing a bicycle helmet, ready for his morning ride. He didn't resist. Detectives read him his rights and placed him under arrest for the murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness. By noon, every local station carried the headline: Zombie hunter arrested in 1992's Canal Murders. For families who had waited half a lifetime, the phone calls were simple. "We think we have him," Angela's mother cried. Melanie's sister said she couldn't find words. For 20 years they'd been told to be patient, that someday technology would find their daughter's killer. That day had come. At the press conference, investigators didn't reveal how they'd identified Miller. They simply said, it was modern DNA technology. Behind the scenes, they knew it had been genealogy, the quiet revolution that was changing the way cold cases were solved. As detectives built the prosecution, they uncovered more unsettling details. Miller had been questioned years earlier about the disappearance of a 13-year-old girl named Brandy Myers, who vanished in 1992, not far from where Angela lived. Her body was never found. Though prosecutors didn't charge him in that case, the connection added weight to the narrative that he'd been hiding in plain sight. For investigators, the moment of the match, that single test tube lighting up under fluorescent lab light, felt like closure and relief in equal measure. A case that began before smartphones, before the internet, before DNA databases, was now solved by technology that barely existed a decade earlier. It was proof that patience and science could bend time. Proof that evidence never really dies. When detectives told reporters later what cracked the case, they all said the same thing. It came down to a piece of glass, a single sip of water. That glass held what Phoenix had searched for since 1992, the identity of a man who believed he'd escaped the past. The cold case that haunted a city for 2 decades was no longer cold. And the quiet canals of Phoenix finally had an answer. The arrest was only the beginning. After more than 20 years of waiting, detectives knew they'd have one chance to make the case stick. DNA had delivered the name, but prosecutors still needed a story that would hold up in court. They needed to show not just who, but how and why. In 2015, investigators began reconstructing Bryan Patrick Miller's life piece by piece. They traced his addresses, jobs, friendships, and movements between 1992 and 1993, the window between the two murders. They collected witness statements from old neighbors who remembered him as quiet but withdrawn, someone who kept to himself and rarely socialized. One neighbor described seeing a young man who often rode his bicycle at night, along the same canal route where Angela Brasso disappeared. Another remembered him working briefly at a nearby fast food restaurant, just blocks from where Melanie Burness was last seen. These fragments, once meaningless, started to form a pattern. Inside the evidence room, detectives re-examined everything recovered from the canal scenes. DNA had already tied him there, but they wanted to rule out coincidence. Technicians checked for secondary transfer, the possibility that the genetic material had arrived through innocent contact. It hadn't. The DNA was direct, conclusive, and matched in multiple locations. Detectives also uncovered records from a 2002 incident in Everett, Washington. Miller had been arrested there for stabbing a woman who survived the attack. The details were disturbingly similar: a sudden, unprovoked assault on a female cyclist. He claimed self-defense, and charges were reduced. But the report added a layer prosecutors couldn't ignore: a history of violence, methodical and controlled. Back in Phoenix, investigators interviewed people from his past. Old classmates described him as intelligent but socially awkward. Former co-workers said he spoke often about horror films and fantasy roleplay, yet almost never about real life. He lived alone, raised his daughter, and spent weekends at conventions dressed as his alter ego, the zombie hunter. To most, it was just eccentric cosplay. But to detectives, it was an echo of a mind fascinated by control, fear, and dominance, the same themes they'd seen in the crime scenes. Still, prosecutors knew that a jury wouldn't convict on personality. They needed the science airtight. For months, forensic analysts repeated every test, checking every chain of custody. They ran blind samples, ensuring there was no contamination. The results never wavered. Bryan Patrick Miller's DNA was the only foreign profile found in the evidence from both murders. That double matched 2 victims. One source became the spine of the prosecution's case. But defense attorneys prepared a counterattack. They argued that the collection methods from the 1990 seconds were outdated, that cross-contamination could not be ruled out, and that the connection between the samples and Miller decades later was circumstantial without corroborating evidence. To counter that claim, investigators dug deeper into his personal history. They searched his home, computers, and storage units. While they didn't find physical trophies, they did recover writing that suggested an obsession with violence and control. Nothing explicitly criminal, but enough to establish pattern and mindset. The case moved slowly through pre-trial hearings. The defense raised competency concerns, claiming Miller struggled with dissociative episodes and emotional detachment. The court ordered psychological evaluations. Experts agreed he understood the charges and could stand trial. Years passed as the legal system worked through the backlog. Meanwhile, for the families, the waiting returned, but this time, with the faint comfort of knowing someone was finally accountable. In interviews, Angela Brasso's mother said she prayed every day for strength to see the trial through. Melanie Burness's sister told reporters that patience had become her only defense against despair. For them, every court date was another step toward closure. By 2020, the case was ready. Prosecutors had hundreds of exhibits, dozens of witnesses, and 2 decades of forensic evolution behind them. The central argument was simple: the same man killed both women, and DNA proved it beyond doubt. Then came the pandemic. Courtrooms across the country closed. Trials froze. And a case that had already waited half a lifetime was delayed again. Finally, in 2022, the trial began. Miller waived a jury and chose a bench trial, leaving his fate in the hands of a single judge. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence, the crime scene analysis, the genealogy work that led to his arrest, and the behavioral history. The defense argued mental illness, claiming Miller suffered from trauma and could not fully comprehend his actions. Courtroom observers described the proceedings as quiet, methodical, and tense. There was no confession, no outburst. Just 2 families seated side by side, listening to the science that told the story their daughters could not. After weeks of testimony, Judge Suzanne Cohen delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. Her ruling was deliberate and final. Bryan Patrick Miller was sentenced to death for the murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness. In her written decision, the judge called the crimes monstrous, senseless, and cold. Outside the courthouse, reporters described a scene of quiet relief. Family members embraced, holding photographs that had once been part of missing person flyers. For them, justice had arrived not swiftly, but surely. For detectives, the case stood as a reminder that technology could revive even the most hopeless files. For the families, it meant the truth had finally outrun the past. And for the city of Phoenix, it closed a chapter that had haunted its canals for 30 years. It had taken nearly 3 decades to reach this moment. 2 young women gone, 2 families waiting, and 1 man sitting in silence at the defense table. Bryan Patrick Miller, the man once known to Phoenix as the Zombie Hunter, now faced 2 counts of first-degree murder. For the families of Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness, the trial wasn't about revenge. It was about validation. It was about hearing the truth spoken aloud. Reporters filled the courtroom gallery. No jury. Miller had waived that right, choosing a bench trial. 1 judge would decide his fate. The prosecution opened with the timeline. 2 murders. Same location. Same pattern. Same DNA. They described the canal corridor as both a crime scene and a character, a silent witness that had held the secret for decades. Then came the evidence. Crime lab technicians testified about the collection process from the 1,990 seconds, how samples were sealed, frozen, and later reanalyzed using modern technology. Each test had produced the same result, a perfect match to Bryan Patrick Miller. The lead detective, Jennifer Erickson, took the stand to explain the genealogy work. She described the family trees, the distant cousins, and the surname that kept appearing until the path led straight to Miller. Her testimony was calm, factual, but personal. She said, "It wasn't luck, it was persistence and science." The prosecution then played surveillance footage from the Chili's restaurant, where investigators had collected the water glass that confirmed the DNA match. It was simple, almost mundane footage: a man taking a drink, smiling, setting the glass down. Yet in that image lay 23 years of waiting. The courtroom was silent. The defense countered with a different story. They didn't deny the DNA. Instead, they focused on Miller's mind. His attorneys argued that he suffered from dissociative disorders linked to childhood trauma, that he experienced emotional detachment so severe he could not process empathy or moral understanding. They called psychologists to testify about his social isolation, his history of being bullied, and his retreat into fantasy. They said the zombie hunter persona was a coping mechanism, not a threat. A costume, not a confession. They portrayed him as a man haunted by his past, not driven by evil. Prosecutors pushed back hard. They acknowledged Miller's trauma but reminded the court that trauma doesn't explain precision. The attacks were deliberate, controlled, and repeated a year apart. They pointed to the similarities between the two crime scenes, the method, the location, the calculated nature of the acts. They also presented testimony from a survivor in Everett, Washington, attacked by Miller in 2002. She described how he'd lured her under the pretense of friendship, then turned violent without warning. The judge allowed the testimony as evidence of intent and pattern. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as she spoke. Over the next several weeks, experts debated DNA probabilities, timelines, and psychological evaluations. There were no dramatic outbursts. No confessions. Miller sat quietly, taking notes, occasionally glancing toward the prosecution table but never toward the families. For those families, each day in court was an exercise in endurance. They had waited through the 1,990 seconds, through technological revolutions, through false leads and anniversaries. Now they sat a few yards from the man investigators said had taken everything from them. When the prosecution rested, Angela's mother wept quietly. Melanie's sister held her hand. They had heard every word, every number, every photograph, but what mattered most was that someone was finally answering for it. After closing arguments, Judge Suzanne Cohen took several weeks to deliberate. Her decision would be final, the culmination of 30 years of work. In the written ruling, she called the crimes acts of monstrous cruelty. She said the evidence was overwhelming, precise, and scientifically irrefutable. When the verdict was read aloud in 2023, the room was still. Guilty on both counts. 2 murders. 2 death sentences. Miller showed no visible reaction. He looked down, expression neutral, as deputies moved to escort him out. His attorneys said only that they planned to appeal. Outside, reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. Family members emerged holding framed photos, the same images from missing person flyers 3 decades earlier. Angela's mother told cameras, "It took 30 years, but we never stopped believing they'd find him." Melanie's sister added, "It's not joy, it's peace." For Detective Erickson, the verdict was bittersweet. The case that had consumed her career was closed, but closure in homicide work never really feels complete. She later said, "You don't celebrate, you exhale." In the courtroom's quiet aftermath, prosecutors collected their exhibits, maps, DNA charts, the family trees that had led to a name. Each piece told a part of the story, the science, the patience, the humanity. The Canal Murders file, once marked cold, was reclassified to cleared by arrest. For the Phoenix Police Department, it was a victory 2 decades in the making. For the families, it was the end of a sentence that had lasted most of their lives. But the verdict didn't erase the mystery completely. Detectives still believed Miller might be connected to other disappearances, including 13-year-old Brandy Myers, who vanished in 1992. Her body was never found. Her family still waits. For now, the story stands complete where it can. Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness finally have justice. The city that feared its own canals can breathe again. The cold case that haunted Phoenix for 30 years ends not with a confession, but with certainty written in DNA, spoken in court, and sealed in the quiet relief of 2 families who never stopped believing time could tell the truth. When the verdict came down, the courtroom exhaled. Decades of waiting had turned into minutes of silence. And then it was over. Bryan Patrick Miller, the man who had hidden in plain sight for more than 20 years, had been found guilty and sentenced to death. The families of Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness finally had a name, a face, and a verdict that matched the horror they'd carried since the early 1,990 seconds. But closure is a complicated word. For some, it means peace. For others, it's just the end of questions without the return of answers. Angela's mother said she still looked for her daughter's reflection every time she passed the canal. Melanie's sister told a reporter she could finally visit the water without shaking. Both described the verdict not as justice, but as release the freedom to stop imagining who the killer might be. Now they knew. For Detective Jennifer Erickson and her team, the conviction felt like the closing of a generational loop. The detectives who'd started the case had long since retired. Some didn't live to see the resolution. Their work had crossed decades, from Polaroids to digital files, from handwritten reports to DNA sequencing. The Canal Murders became a textbook case in persistence, the proof that cold cases can still breathe. The Phoenix Police Department formally retired the case in 2023. At the ceremony, a senior officer spoke quietly. Time didn't win, the evidence did. Detectives placed flowers along the same canal paths where the crimes had occurred. No speeches, no cameras, just a quiet moment by the water. But even in victory, there was one name that kept returning: Brandi Myers. 13 years old. Last seen in May 1992, just months before Angela Brasso's murder. She disappeared while canvassing her neighborhood for a school fundraiser. Her body was never found. In 2015, after Miller's arrest, detectives reopened the Brandi Myers case. They discovered that Miller had lived in the same neighborhood when Brandi vanished. He was 20 at the time. Witnesses placed him nearby that day. Forensic evidence was limited. The case had gone cold long before modern DNA collection existed, but the timeline and proximity were too close to ignore. Investigators interviewed Miller's ex-wife, who shared stories from their early years together. She described a man prone to violent mood swings, obsessed with control, yet outwardly polite. When asked about Brandi Myers, she hesitated, then told detectives that Miller had once made a chilling remark about a girl who came to the door and never should have. It was anecdotal, not enough for charges, but enough to haunt everyone who heard it. To this day, police consider Miller the prime suspect in Brandi's disappearance. Without remains, they can't prove it. Her family still holds vigils every May. Her sister, Kristen, keeps a photo of Brandi as a smiling middle schooler, a girl with a fundraising sheet in her hand, frozen in time. She says, "If he did this, I just want her back. That's all." The ghost of Brandi Myers lingers over the Canal Murders, a reminder that justice can bring peace but not perfection. Some stories stay unfinished, even when the villain has a name. In Phoenix, the canal paths have changed. The dirt trails of the 1,990 seconds are now paved bike lanes lined with lights and memorial plaques. One small sign near Metrocenter reads simply, "In memory of Angela and Melanie, you are not forgotten." Cyclists ride past without always noticing. But for those who know, the sight of the water under morning light carries weight. A place once marked by fear now stands as a monument to patience and to what science can uncover when time refuses to cooperate. Detective Erickson still keeps a copy of the final case report in her office. She says she reads it once a year, not to relive the details, but to remind herself why cold cases matter. "These files wait for us," she told a reporter. "We don't wait for them." For the families, life after the verdict is quieter, but the grief has its own rhythm. Birthdays come and go. Photos fade. But the sense of dignity restored by the trial remains. Angela's mother visits the canal on her daughter's birthday each November. She brings flowers and sits for a while, listening to the sound of the water. She says it feels peaceful now, as if the place itself has exhaled. Melanie's sister continues to speak at victim advocacy events, reminding audiences that justice doesn't happen on its own. "Someone has to keep asking," she says. "Someone has to keep calling." The case that once terrified Phoenix has become a story about endurance of families, detectives, and a city that refused to let two women vanish into history. In the end, the Phoenix Canal Murders were solved not by luck, but by stubbornness. By the idea that truth, no matter how old, still has a pulse. The evidence waited 23 years for the right eyes, the right tools, the right moment. And when that moment came, the story finally found its shape. Still, the desert keeps its secrets. The canals move quietly under the city, carrying both water and memory. Somewhere along those banks, Brandi Myers' story remains unfinished, a small, stubborn whisper, reminding Phoenix that even solved cases can leave echoes. The story of the Canal Murders didn't end with the verdict. It echoed through the families, through the department, and through a city that had lived with the case for 30 years. In 2024, Phoenix police held a small ceremony in the department's cold case unit. No reporters, just detectives past and present standing in a room lined with evidence boxes. On one table sat two framed photos, Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness. Beside them, a single rose for Brandy Myers. Detective Jennifer Erickson spoke quietly. She said, "Every case like this teaches us that evidence is patient. We're the ones who have to catch up." AD. Behind her, a new generation of investigators listened, men and women who had grown up after the murders, now learning that the past never really stays buried. The Phoenix Canal Murders became a benchmark for how cold cases could be solved through persistence and technology. The case influenced statewide reforms in evidence preservation and data sharing. Every homicide file in Maricopa County was re-examined, prioritized by available DNA. Some that had sat untouched for decades began moving again. The ripple effect spread beyond Arizona. Law enforcement conferences cited the Canal case as an example of genealogy meets perseverance. But outside the precinct, the story belonged to the people who had carried it the longest. Angela's mother moved back to the Midwest in 2024. Before leaving, she visited the canal one last time. She told a local reporter, "I used to think of this as the place where everything ended. Now I see it as the place where she was found." Melanie's sister still lives in Phoenix. She leads a scholarship fund in her sister's name, money for young women pursuing law enforcement or forensic science. Each year, she visits the trail on the anniversary of the verdict, leaving 2 flowers in the water. One for Melanie, one for Angela. The city has changed. Metrocenter Mall, once a landmark in both the victims' lives and the investigation, closed permanently in 2020. The Chili's where detectives collected the decisive DNA sample now sits empty, its parking lot cracked and quiet. The canals remain, winding through Phoenix like veins, carrying the memory of what happened and how the city responded. Community groups now organize an annual ride along the same trail once feared. Cyclists wear small ribbons, purple for Angela, blue for Melanie, yellow for Brandy. They call it the Light Ride. It's part memorial, part reminder. The past can't be erased, but it can be reclaimed. The case also reshaped public understanding of forensic genealogy. Before 2018, few outside law enforcement had heard of it. After cases like the Canal Murders and the Golden State Killer, it became the frontier of cold case work. It showed that justice isn't bound by the calendar, that a name can surface even after decades of silence. Yet, there's an ethical shadow too. Debates over privacy, genetic data, and the balance between public access and personal rights continue. Even Detective Erickson admits the science that solved the case also raises hard questions about how far investigators should reach into family trees. "Technology doesn't stop evolving," she said. "We have to evolve with it." In 2025, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office launched a new program named in honor of Angela and Melanie. Its purpose: to fund cold case DNA testing and train investigators in digital genealogy methods. The program's motto is printed on every folder: "Evidence waits, justice doesn't." The Phoenix Canal Murders became more than a case. It became a mirror reflecting how much cities change and how much they don't. The same canals that once marked fear now reflect streetlights and murals of remembrance. Artists have painted small tributes along the path, subtle, respectful. Angela's bicycle wheel rendered in mosaic tiles. Melanie's flute etched into the concrete railing. And in one corner, a hand-painted note: "Brandy, we're still looking." For the families, grief became purpose. For detectives, closure became momentum. And for the community, memory became endurance. Every city has a story that tests it. For Phoenix, this was that story. It spanned 3 decades, 3 victims, and a technology that didn't exist when it began. It proved that even in a place where water and time never stop moving, truth can surface if someone refuses to stop looking. As the years pass, the names Angela Brasso and Melanie Burness remain etched in plaques, in policy, in memory. The man who took their lives sits on death row, awaiting the final chapter of his own story. And somewhere, another detective, in another city, is opening a cold file, reminded that this one, the Canal case, broke open because someone believed patience could outlast fear. Sometimes justice comes slowly. Sometimes it rides behind you for 30 years before catching up. But when it does, it changes everything, not just the case, but the people who refuse to let it go.